Team Trump contends with more moves from special counsel Robert Mueller, while Hillary Clinton pushes her view of what happened in the 2016 campaign. It's all the latest on this edition of PoliticKing. Welcome to PoliticKing. I'm Larry King. According to multiple reports, the Trump campaign has begun turning over documents to investigators working for the Office of Special Counsel Robert Mueller. The reports contend that this is all part of Mr. Mueller's investigation into possible collusion between the Trump campaign and Moscow. So what's the significance of this? And what might it portend, if anything? Let's talk about that with Lanny Davis, who's in Washington, D.C. He serves as White House special counsel during the Clinton administration, also a strategic media and crisis management expert. And in Miami, Kendall Coffee, formerly served as a U.S. attorney, is currently chairman of the Southern District Conference of the Florida Federal Judicial Nominating Commission. We welcome them both. All right, Lanny, we'll start with you. What do you make of the Trump campaign handing over documents to special counsel dealing with the campaign? They've already turned them over to congressional investigators.
Well, Mr. Coffey will be much more expert about peeling away conspiracies under the major crime would be the collusion crime. But as we remember as a political person from President Nixon's ordeal during Watergate, it's not the crime that does you in, it's the cover-up. And the president's decision to fire James Comey and then participate in a dissembling, dishonest explanation for the meeting that took place in June of 2016, where there was conversation about the Russian government representative sharing incriminating information according to the email to Donald Jr. President Trump himself participated on Air Force One, undenied, in a misleading report that constituted potentially a cover-up. So the subpoenas from Mr. Mueller seem to me to be starting with the outer layers of a conspiracy to cover up or obstruct. And when if they ever do get to the collusion evidence, they still have a crime in an obstruction of justice potentially and a conspiracy.
Kendall, is this beginning to look like it looks like a duck, sounds like a duck?
Well, what we're seeing is with the turnover of documents is just a critical, necessary, and ordinary, in a sense, part of an investigation. You can't really speak to the key witnesses until you have every scrap of paper, of email, of anything, so that you got all the information. Otherwise, either whether it's refreshing the witness's recollection or catching the witness on some misstatements, you're just not ready to go to the witness interview. So that's what they're going to do. And Lanny very properly touched on some of the areas of criminal law interest. There's certainly in the campaign phase, and these are campaign documents, a focus on was there a criminal conspiracy. Collusion itself isn't a crime. So what they're looking to do is see whether they have evidence during the course of the campaign of criminal conspiracy, which could include anything from hacking computers or conspiracy to accept improper campaign contributions from foreign nationals or a foreign government. The additional categories of criminal interest are, of course, whether people who went into the Trump administration falsified through inclusion or omission material information on their financial disclosure forms or on their national security forms. And we know already that there are a couple people, including General Flynn, who got some real questions about that. The third area, and Lanny mentioned, this is often the most important area, is possible obstruction or false statement. And that's going to get a lot of attention. That may not be the focus of the campaign's documents because that was largely pre-inauguration, but it's nevertheless all part of a picture because the more guilt you show during the earlier phase, the more motive there is for people to obstruct later on. So this is all part of a continuum. And while it's significant that documents are being turned over, we still have a ways to go. They've got to go through them. They've got to categorize them. They've got to classify them, hand them out to all the different agents. And it will be a while before their interviews. So I think we're still a number of months before this investigation concludes with any findings.
Lanny, what do you think the significance is of looking into Michael Flynn's son? Because if the son was involved, the father is not going to want the son to go to jail.
I don't know a thing about the allegations against the son, and I always warn people when they're attacking clients of mine that there's a presumption of innocence and we shouldn't let media jump ahead of the facts, which they always seem to do. So even when it comes to Michael Flynn's son or President Trump or anyone, those of us that once in a while appear on the great Larry King show have to be very careful about any conclusions. If the son is under suspicion, dad is going to be concerned. And by the way, that applies to a son-in-law of the President of the United States. Mr. Kushner has failed to reveal many of the financial matters on his disclosure form, such that he's had to amend a number of times. And the reasons for that omission are very troubling, because it can't be over and over again that you forget material information. So that's an area that he has to worry about. I think the biggest area I'm going back to is the President of the United States, I wouldn't say smoking gun, has admitted to participating, if not directing and dictating, a public misleading statement, by definition misleading because it omitted material facts about the email exchange with his son, Donald Jr. If I were the counsel to the president, as I used to be many years ago, I would be astounded that the president himself was involved in drafting a publicly misleading statement in the middle of a criminal investigation where that statement is actually potentially evidence of an obstruction of justice.
We'll continue the conversation with Lanny Davis and Kendalл Coffee right after the break. Kendalll, you can comment on what Lanny said, and I'd also like you to comment, being a former U.S. attorney, about Sarah Sanders, the press secretary, saying that the Justice Department should investigate more about Comey and false testimony he apparently gave to Congress to look to prosecute James Comey. What do you make of that, Kendalll?
Well, let me first about the president's alleged, we'll call it, spinning the statement that his son was to issue about the meeting in Trump Plaza. As we know, it's a crime to mislead federal investigators. It's not a crime to mislead the press. So that'll be the key issue. But what's going to be fascinating is when the day comes and the FBI and Mueller interview Trump, what is the president going to say about that?
Well, Lanny, apparently we've had some technical difficulties between here in Los Angeles and a fiber connection to Miami. So if you could pick up on what I was talking to Kendalll about, and we apologize to Kendalll Coffee. We hope to have him back soon at another date. But Lanny, what about what he was commenting on, and about the White House claiming that Comey gave false information and the Justice Department should prosecute him?
Well, first of all, Kendalll has it right. It's not a crime to lie to the public. Otherwise, we'd have a lot of presidents in jail. But it is a crime to make false statements when you're questioned about it. The president will have to explain at some point to Mr. Mueller and his prosecutors whether he participated in that false statement that was issued to the public. If he says, yes, I did, then he'll have to be honest and explain why he intentionally misled everyone. Was he afraid about evidence of a collusion meeting that occurred in June of 2016 with the Russian government talking about trashing Hillary Clinton? And what does he know about that? So there's a chance that it will still come back to haunt him. On Mr. Comey, if there was a crime of poor judgment, Mr. Comey would be serving a lot of time. He exercised poor judgment in the handling of the Hillary Clinton emails. The Deputy Attorney General, who President Trump praised, wrote exactly the truth, that Mr. Comey exceeded all boundaries of good judgment and possibly Justice Department rules when he expressed a personal opinion on the evidence in public as an investigator. You're just not allowed to slime people without charging people, and that's what he did to Hillary Clinton. And the poor judgment of sending a letter without any facts that caused the election outcome to change, which I believe the data shows. was an extremely poor judgment 11 days from the election. But in terms of prosecuting him, this is Donald Trump doing his usual, change the topic because the focus on him is making him uncomfortable. It's an absurd charge by, I don't take Sarah Huckabee seriously anymore, just as we stopped taking Mr. Spicer seriously, because he carries forward lies from his client, and no press secretary that I've ever heard of does that. So whatever Ms. Huckabee says, she's being told to say, and it's just not a serious comment.
This administration has been a boon to the renewal of the New York Times and Washington Post. The printed press was in trouble. They're no longer, at least on those two papers, in trouble. The Post especially has been doing an incredible job. Where do they get these ins?
There's a lot of leaking
and the
going
Journal.
on. Well, this is a White House that leaks like a sieve, which shows very little loyalty to the president. As I said, it's very common for people in the White House to give reporters stories that benefit the president. I try to do that all the time, and that's what I meant in jest about being a leaker. I was trying to get reporters to write the defenses to the attacks on President Clinton or favorable stories. This is a group of people working for President Trump who are leaking stories detrimental to the president. And I find the disloyalty in the inner circle in the White House quite remarkable. So it does suggest to me that Mr. Trump is worrying people around him that they may get involved in the criminal prosecution by being associated with some of the activities that are under review. That's my only way to figure out all the leaking going on.
Can't Mr. Kelly, a strong man, chief of staff, do something about it?
Oh, probably going back to George Washington, every president of the United States has tried to stop leaking among his ranks. And I would say, Mr. Kelly, don't waste your time. It was Richard Nixon's desire to stop the leaks that actually got him in trouble with obstruction of justice and ultimately Watergate. The only thing you can do is inspire loyalty among people. And they're going to be talking to the media. What is a leak? It's somebody who's a reporter calling you on the phone. Can you comment on something? And my answer would be, I can't comment to you on the record, but there's something about President Clinton you should know. I'll be on background. That's what's called a leak. It means not for attribution. This White House, like every White House, does that with reporters, and they should do it if it's in defense of the president. What's unusual here are the number of people within the president's inner circle on background without attribution, quote, leaking detrimental information about the president. Even though I oppose this president, there's something called loyalty that if you don't like working for President Trump, you ought to resign and get out.
Yeah.
You shouldn't be leaking detrimental information.
Always great talking to you, Lanny. Thanks.
Thank you, Larry.
I want to thank Kendalл Coffee. I'm sorry for that mishap there, and we hope to have Kendalл back soon. Thanks to both of them for their time today. We'll be back with more politicking right after the break. Welcome back to politicking. Let's turn to our other political news with our my dynamic duo. Joining me to talk about that political analyst is Amy Holmes in New York. She's a former staffer to Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist, previously served as anchor for the Blaze TV, and in Washington, Democratic strategist Julian Epstein. He served as special minority counsel to the House Judiciary Committee and is the former staff director of the Government Oversight and Reform Committee. Let's start with Steve Bannon. He says, guys, that the firing of James Comey was the worst mistake in modern political history. Amy, you agree?
I don't think you're going to get any disagreement from me, or I would suspect Julian. It was a huge mistake. And at the time, I was really stunned that the White House thought that it would be a popular decision because Comey was criticized from both sides of the aisle. We've heard Hillary Clinton criticizing him as she's embarked on her book tour. But, you know, James Comey, as Steve Bannon said, he was the head of an institution. He was also in the middle of an investigation. So when you fire someone, it's going to certainly certainly be explosive. And as James Comey testified to Congress, he said that he sent that memo of his meeting with President Trump to his friend at Columbia University in the hopes that it would be released publicly and that would trigger the special counsel. And indeed, that chain of events, it happened, and now President Trump is facing Robert Mueller.
Julian, I assume you agree with that. And what do you make of the White House now continuing to try to get the Justice Department to criminalize Mr. Comey?
I think it shows that Sarah Huckabee Sanders and the rest of the team over there are really kind of the bad news bears when it comes to how they're handling this investigation. I mean, there's no other word for it other than lame-brained. There was nothing remotely illegal about former FBI Director Comey providing the memo either to a friend at a law school or to the New York Times. It's perfectly legal. It's perfectly within the scope of whistleblower laws, so long as no classified information is being revealed. And the idea that the President and the White House would then try to sic the Inspector General on former FBI Director Comey is part of a larger narrative of obstruction of justice. I mean, the President has the authority, as Amy pointed out on the show last time, to fire an FBI director, but he doesn't have the authority to fire the FBI director if the purpose of that firing is to stop an investigation into his administration. And the President admitted in an interview on NBC News that the reason that he fired Comey was because of his frustration with the Russia investigation. And that's almost admitting the kind of the corrupt purpose requirement under the obstruction of justice statute. And now, in fact, the President is under criminal investigation 7 months into his office for obstruction of justice. And not only that, but the appointment of the new special counsel, Robert Mueller, who is widely respected on both sides of the aisle. In fact, Republicans have introduced legislation in the Senate to protect him from being fired by the President. Now you have a much broader investigation that's not just looking at obstruction of justice, but looking at all kinds of possible collusion between the Trump administration and the Trump campaign with Russia, and looking at a whole host of other financial arrangements that Trump and the Trump inner team may have had with Russian interests that could have violated criminal laws. So this thing has gone from bad to worse by the mishandling by this White House.
Amy, do you expect Mr. Bannon to be a constant troublemaker?
It seems something he likes to do, which is to set fires, as he has said, by his own testimony, that he wants to bring the whole system down, bring down the establishment, and that includes Republicans. And when he was, heading up Breitbart.com, that was, his bread and butter, and what he seemed to really relish, to mix my metaphors or pile them on, however you want to say it. But will he be influential? I think that's a separate question. And insofar as Donald Trump is still calling him up, which has been reported, yes, he's influential if he has a direct line to the President of the United States. And he can also be influential if he is sort of directing his readers/followers of Breitbart.com to be thorns in the side of Republican leadership. And he can do that by, publishing article after article, which he's done in the past, in opposition to Paul Ryan, and basically ginning up Steve Bannon's base to be in a constant state of warfare with the Republican Party.
More with Amy Holmes and Julian Epstein after the break. Julian, 16 members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, are not running for re-election. What do you make of that?
I think it shows that Donald Trump may have the unique ability of making the House of Representatives great again, in the sense that he may turn the House of Representatives Democrat in the next election. Democrats need a pickup of 24 seats. And if you listen to what the Republicans who are not running, what they're saying on the record and off the record, often not for attribution, kind of the way Lonnie was just talking about in a previous segment, many of them are rebelling against the ideological rigidity that some on the far right want to place on the Republican Party. So I think it shows that there is a civil war going on inside the Republican Party between the establishment and anti-establishment wings. And I think it's a civil war that's gotten much worse under Trump. Remember, Trump's approval ratings right now are about 2/3 of the American public don't like him, don't trust him, and don't approve of the job he's doing.
Amy, as a Republican, are you discouraged? You're an independent, but you're a Republican. You've supported Republican candidates. You've been we know you a long time. You're not a liberal Democrat, okay?
Okay, not a Republican, not a liberal. I'm a conservative. I don't necessarily support the Republican Party.
As a conservative, are you disturbed by the actions of this administration?
As a conservative, I see that Donald Trump in certain ways is trying to be, or is rather, non-ideological, that he's being pragmatic. We saw this with the debt ceiling deal, that he reached out to Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. They had a summit in the White House where they were all smiles and raised the debt limit without any sort of, without cuts to spending that some Republicans were demanding. But I would remind viewers that Donald Trump long broadcast this intention to work with the other side. Back in March, he had Steve Mnuchin, his Treasury Secretary, meet with moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans in a House caucus called the Problem Solvers Caucus to address tax reform. He had Steve Mnuchin, his Treasury Secretary, meet with Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell to talk about the debt ceiling. And that was this spring when he said he wanted to raise that debt ceiling a clean hike. He did not want all these things attached to it. So it really shouldn't have come as any surprise that that was what he was driving toward last week or what he's going to do now on tax reform. I think Republicans, they have a big question in front of them, which is, are they going to try to pass tax reform or / tax cuts, however they want to go about it? Are they going to try to pass this on a partisan party line vote under these special rules in the Senate? It's called reconciliation. Or are they actually going to get on Donald Trump's playbook and reach out to Democrats to try to fashion a bipartisan piece of legislation and piece of law? I actually favor the latter, because I think when you have bipartisan buy-in to something that, or you need bipartisan buy-in rather, to something that big and that consequential for the American people, I think it should have happened with Obamacare, for example.
Julian, do you see the president turning a little?
No, I think it was kind of a last-minute impulse on his part last week to make a deal with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer on something that most people don't really understand. It's the extension of the debt limit for 3 months while they work out the continuing resolution of the budget. Donald Trump is hemmed in with the far-right conservative base. It's the only portion of the voting public that actually support him, about the third of American voters who are far-right and will actually continue to support him. He has offered almost nothing that would be considered bipartisan or centrist. The economy has worsened under Donald Trump. The job production numbers are worse under Donald Trump than they were under President Obama.